scientists discovered that everything from rocks to molecules is conscious. Consciousness permeates reality, and rather than being just a unique feature of human subjective experience, it's the foundation of the universe present in every particle and all physical matter. This sounds like easily dismissible bunk, but its traditional attempts to explain consciousness continue to fail. The panpsychist view is increasingly being taken seriously by credible philosophers, neuroscientists, and physicists, including figures such as neuroscientist Christoph Koch and physicist Roger Penrose. Why should we think common sense is a good guide to what the universe is like, says Philip Goff, a philosophy professor at Central European University, Budapest, Hungary. Einstein tells us weird things about the nature of time that counters common sense. Quantum mechanics runs counter to common sense. Our intuitive reaction is not necessarily a good guide to the nature of reality. David Chalmers, a philosophy of mind professor at New York University, laid out the hard problem of consciousness in 1995, demonstrating that there was still no answer to the question of what causes consciousness. Traditionally, two dominant perspectives, materialism and dualism, have provided a framework for solving this problem. Both lead to seemingly intractable complications. Physics is just structure. It can explain biology, but there's a gap, and that gap is consciousness. The materialist viewpoint states that consciousness is derived entirely from physical matter. It's unclear, though, exactly how this could work. It's very hard to get consciousness out of non-consciousness, says Chalmers. Physics is just structure. It can explain biology, but there's a gap, and that is consciousness. Dualism holds that consciousness is separate and distinct from physical matter, but that then raises the question of how consciousness interacts and has an effect on the physical world. Panpsychism offers an attractive alternative solution. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of physical matter. Every single particle in existence has an unimaginably simple form of consciousness, says Goff. These particles then come together to form the more complex forms of consciousness, such as humans' subjective experiences. This is not meant to imply that particles have a coherent worldview or actively think, merely that there's some inherent subjective experience of consciousness in even the tiniest particle. Panpsychism does not necessarily imply that every inanimate object is conscious. Panpsychists usually don't take tables and other artifacts to be conscious as a whole, writes Hedda Massel-Morsch, a philosophy researcher at New York University Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness, in an email, saying rather than the table could be understood as a collection of particles that each have their own very simple form of consciousness. But then again, panpsychism could very well be implying that conscious tables exist. One interpretation of the theory holds that any system is conscious, says Chalmers. Rocks will be conscious, spoons will be conscious, the earth will be conscious. Any kind of aggregation gives you consciousness. Interest in panpsychism has grown in part thanks to the increased academic focus on consciousness itself, following on from Chalmers' hard problem paper. Philosophers at NYU, home to one of the leading philosophy of mind departments, have made panpsychism a feature of serious study. There have been several credible academic books on the subject in recent years, and popular articles taking panpsychism seriously. One of the most popular and credible contemporary neuroscience theories on consciousness, Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, further lends credence to the panpsychism. Tononi argues that something will have a form of consciousness if the information contained within the structure is sufficiently integrated or unified, and so the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Because it applies to all structures, not just the human brain, integrated information theory shares that panpsychist view that physical matter has innate conscious experience. Goff who has written an academic book on consciousness and is working on another that approaches the subject from a more popular science perspective, notes that there were credible theories on the subject dating back to the 1920s. Thinkers including philosopher Bertrand Russell and physicist Arthur Eddington made a serious case for panpsychism, but the field lost momentum after World War II, when philosophy again largely focused on analytical philosophical questions of language and logic. Interest picked up again in the 2000s, thanks to, but both to recognition of hard problem and to increase adoption of the structural realist approach in physics, claims Chalmers. This approach views physics as describing structure and not the underlying non-structural elements. Physical science tells us a lot about the nature of matter than we tend to assume, says Goff. Eddington, the English scientist who experimentally confirmed Einstein's theory of general relativity in the early 20th century, argued there's a gap in our picture of the universe. We know what matter does, but not what it is. We can put consciousness into this gap. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? In Eddington's view, Goff writes in an email, it's silly to suppose that underlying nature has nothing to do with consciousness, and then to wonder where consciousness comes from. Stephen Hawking had previously asked, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? Goff adds, the Russell-Eddington proposal is that it is consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. The biggest problem caused by panpsychism is known as the combination problem. Precisely how do small particles of consciousness collectively form a more complex consciousness? Consciousness may exist in all particles, but that does not answer the question of how these tiny fragments of physical consciousness come together to create the more complex experience of human consciousness. Any theory that attempts to answer that question would effectively determine which complex systems, from inanimate objects to plants to ants, count as conscious. An alternative panpsychic perspective holds that rather than individual particles holding consciousness and coming together, the universe as a whole is conscious. Says Goff, is not the same as believing the universe is a unified divine being. It's more like seeing it is a cosmic mess. Nevertheless, it does reflect a perspective that the world is a top-down creation, where every individual thing is derived from the universe rather than a bottom-up version where objects are built from the smallest particle. Goff believes quantum entanglement, the finding that certain particles behave as a single unified system even when they're separated by such immense distances there cannot be a casual signal between them, suggests the universe functions as a fundamental whole rather than a collection of discrete parts. Such theories sound incredible, and perhaps they are, but then again, so is every other possible theory that explains consciousness. Chalmers says, the more I think about any theory, the less plausible it becomes. One starts as a materialist, then turns into a dualist, then a panpsychist, and then an idealist, he adds, echoing his paper on the subject. Idealism holds that conscious experience is the only thing that truly exists. From that perspective, panpsychism is quite moderate. Chalmers quotes his colleague, the philosopher John Perry, who says, if you think about consciousness long enough, you either become a panpsychist or you go into administration. And this is on Soul Ask. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.